All right, in this lesson, we are learning about genetic diseases and pedigrees. This is part of topic 3.4. Remember, not all of the syllabus points are covered in this video. There was a previous video called Mendelian Genetics. Okay, let's talk about genetic diseases. They are caused, obviously, by a specific gene, and there's about 4,000 in humans alone. So, add that multiple more to other species. Now, most genetic diseases are pretty rare. All right, and they're not contagious. That's the important part. These are diseases, but not like the diseases that we talk about in everyday life. So most of these are due to recessive traits. Now, genetic disease is really interesting. It can be inherited, right? The parents can be carriers of a particular allele and pass that on to offspring. Now, they might actually physically show that they have the disease, or they might be carrying that, but it can be silent because it is recessive. But there are also dominant traits that are turned into or can become genetic diseases. Now, when 2 copies of the recessive gene are inherited, obviously that's when the disease can manifest physically. If the trait's dominant, there's no carriers. Now, the trait can also be acquired. You can acquire a mutation. It can be acquired de novo, which means it's random, or it can be acquired via a mutagen. Now, mutagens are things that can cause them, but again, you can always have an error in replication, that just in the normal functioning of the cell, something goes wrong, some gene is disrupted, and therefore there is flow-on effects from that. However, if there is a mutagen involved, it can cause genetic disease or it can cause cancer. And many environmental factors can lead to mutations if the mutations start to accumulate and are passed on as well if the gametes there are affected. So things like radiation from the sun, things like radiation from nuclear power plants, or situations like Chernobyl, Fukushima, or the atom bomb with Hiroshima. So large doses of radiation can cause these things. Chemical, mutagens can be chemical, like Agent Orange in the Vietnam War. If you've ever heard the story of Erin Brockovich, they talked about something called chromium, which is a heavy metal, and those kinds of things can continue for multiple generations, but even a more everyday thing like smoking can cause those mutagens and therefore cancer. There are also biological mutagens, things like viruses, so like the HPV virus, can actually affect ovarian cells and cause cancerous changes, which is why we vaccinate you against that particular virus, and why we do regular checks of ovarian cells. Now, I did a really quick Google search to find things that might be considered mutagens, and I honestly found this: burnt toast, makeup, processed foods, plastic water bottles, microwaves, artificial sweeteners, hair dye, antiperspirants, power lines, mobile phone radiation. And that was like 3 clicks. So it's really important that when we read things like this in the media, that we have to find really good hard evidence. It needs to be collected over many years and many generations to determine what the actual impact is, not just rumours that we hear because we heard it on Today Tonight or A Current Affair. Okay, let's talk about some mutations that can be hereditary or passed down through the family, and cystic fibrosis is one of them. Now, cystic fibrosis is caused by a point mutation, so one base there in a gene which regulates chloride intake in a cell membrane. So what it does is actually change the viscosity of the mucus lining of certain ducts in some organs. So people with cystic fibrosis can have quite a lot of mucus build up in their lungs, which is quite unpleasant and can be life-threatening. So it is an autosomal recessive inheritance, and that means that you need 2 copies of that allele for it to manifest in you. However, it does mean that in this particular case, we've got both parents who are carriers. They both carry the allele that can cause the problem, but they don't physically manifest it. It is hiding and therefore looks like it can skip a generation. Huntington's, however, is the opposite. It is an autosomal dominant. So it's on an autosome, which is a non-sex chromosome, but if you have that allele, you will show that you have that disease. So in this particular case, the affected father has the affected allele and therefore physically manifests the disease, and in that case, anyone who receives that affected allele from him will pick it up. Now, unfortunately, Huntington's is a pretty unpleasant situation to be in. It is a disease of the neurons. It causes a loss of a lot of loss of neurons, so neuron death, and it can cause mental and physical capacity to be lost quite early in life sometimes. Unfortunately, because it is that dominant, if you pick up any one or 2 of those capital H, that dominant allele, you will be unfortunately with Huntington's there. Now, there can be sex-linked genes. So remember, females have two X's, all right, and biological males have the X and the Y. So if there is a gene that appears on the X chromosome, females have two options there, okay? They can kind of silence their dodgy one and express their normal one, shall we say. However, if there's a problem with men, where if there's a problem with a particular gene on their X chromosome, they don't have another one to go to. So that means that often in males, they are the ones expressing the sex-linked genetic disorders. So one of the most common ones we see is actually red-green colorblindness, and that's the one that we will focus on in class as well. So we're talking about a normal allele here in blue and the disappointingly mutated one there in pink. If the male picks it up, they've got no other option but to express it and therefore are more likely to be affected, as opposed to the girl, which will become a carrier because she can always code something for on the other X chromosome. So here's our red-green colorblindness, exactly the same situation. And another really common one is called haemophilia, which is a disorder where the blood does not clot properly due to missing proteins in the blood. And again, that is X-linked and can travel quite a long way through many families, like the royal family. All right, pedigrees are one way we can visualize how the traits actually run through the family, and you're made up of your own cell lines there, or your own family line, sorry, and you use specific shapes and shading and things like that to show the connections and relationships and phenotypes. So different types of inheritance, like our autosomal dominant or our autosomal recessive, can be shown in different ways. And so this one here is sex-linked as well. So even though these all look remarkably similar, these are skills we will hone in class to make sure we understand how to recognize what type of inheritance is on each particular pedigree. So that takes quite a bit of practice. Here are our syllabus points. Remember, these are not all of them, and we have a second video with this particular topic as well.